Hi, my name is Abigail Hammond. I'm an author and a reader, and I love to talk about books. That's what I do on this channel. And today I wanted to talk about one of my favorite classics of all time, Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. And this book is so underrated. I feel like it's the forgotten Brontë sisters book. Everybody knows Jane Eyre, everybody knows Wuthering Heights, and everybody knows The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne is really good. I feel like less people know that one too. You have Shirley by Charlotte Brontë, The Professor, Villette. There's a lot of good ones, but Anne Brontë is the sister I think that is most often forgotten, and I think her books are most often overlooked. And Agnes Grey especially is very overlooked, and I find that interesting and very sad because I love this book so much. To me, this book feels like a warm blanket. I love it. It's so short that it's easily read in one sitting or two sittings depending on how much time you have. It's a very like simple book. There's not a lot of ups and downs. It's not like there's no wife in the attic like in Jane Eyre. There's no crazy, dark, twisted leading men. There's nothing like that. It's a very sweet and simple story, but that's what I love about it, and that's what I think makes it so endearing. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about Agnes Grey. I'll avoid spoilers. There won't be spoilers in this. I'll just give you sort of thoughts and some premise and why you should read it. Many people make the comparison of Agnes Grey that have read it to Jane Eyre, and Jane Eyre actually came out after Anne wrote Agnes Grey, but I believe Jane Eyre was published first. So many people will read this one and think, oh, it's kind of like Jane Eyre, but not as good. But no, it's great. So the story opens and we have Agnes's family, her mother, father, and her sister, and they are the most loving, sweet family. Her mother actually was born very well-to-do in society, very wealthy, but she fell in love with this poor clergyman, and against all of her family's wishes, they cut her off for this. She married him anyway because she loved him, and there was not a day in her life where she regretted losing out on that money and that inheritance and the social status and everything. She was very happy to be married to her husband. She loved him very much, and she loved her daughters very much. So Agnes grows up in a very loving home, and even though times are hard, even though they don't have very much money very often, though things can be tight, she doesn't care. None of them mind because there's so much love there, and they're just so happy. And the only person that seems to mind is Agnes's father, who gets very worried all the time that he can't provide more for his daughters and for his wife, and that's very sweet. And so you can see that the book opens up with a very sweet family, very different from the other Brontë sisters books, which most often open up with tragedy or these backstories that are sort of painful or difficult. But Agnes is raised in this wonderful family, and eventually she decides she wants to help bring some money in for the family, so she offers to go and work as a governess, and that's sort of where the story kicks off. And Anne Brontë actually based a lot of Agnes's experiences based on her own experiences as a governess. It's interesting because you get stories of these kids that are absolutely behaving like wild animals and just being terrible children. You get stories of how the parents treat the governess. You get stories of the older children, 17 or 18 years old, that are being watched by the governess still, and how frivolous and vain they can be. And it's very entertaining to see those stories. And a lot of people say, oh, Anne Brontë just makes Agnes complain too much. She's not complaining. When she describes these working conditions and how difficult it was, actually, I think she was just being very honest about what life was like for a working woman working as a governess at that time. And in the preface of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is another one of Anne's books, I think the only other one that's been published, unless I'm very mistaken, she mentions that critics had complained about it. She wrote this herself in the preface of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. She mentions that critics had complained that she was too harsh with her descriptions and too harsh, I guess, for lack of a better word, with their descriptions of working life as a governess and with the things she saw and experienced. And so she tried to tone it down in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but she was adamant that no, that's actually how it was. So it's an interesting thing to see her sort of talking about her own experiences. But again, it's done in a way that's never feels like too much. And it's honestly very humorous. There are many humorous parts of this book where it's genuinely either laugh out loud funny, or I found myself smiling the whole time, because even when she is complaining about these crazy kids, or recounting the weird conversations she has with the parents or with the other servants, or even just when Agnes is in her own head thinking, there are some very funny things. And I think Anne Bronté's humor is very dry. Like, you don't expect it. It almost is it's very sarcastic, very dry humor. And so if you're not really paying attention, it may just come across as complaining or as just being very negative, but it's actually very funny. And if you're really watching, it's a hilarious book in many circumstances. It feels almost more akin, in that respect, it feels more akin to a Jane Austen novel than a traditional Brontë Gothic novel, in my opinion. Like, Jane Austen obviously is hilarious, very, very witty, good social satire and commentary. This is different from that, but it still feels more in that vein to me than it does in the vein of something like Jane Eyre, in my opinion. When I read Jane Eyre, I have a very different feeling from what I get when I'm reading Agnes Grey. But Agnes Grey, again, very funny, and there's a lot of parts that are genuinely hilarious. There's one, I won't spoil it, but one of the chapters, it comes right at the beginning of the chapter, and it just catches me by surprise every time, no matter how many times I reread this book, and it just cracks me up. But it's very lighthearted in one sense, because even though it deals with some sort of difficult topics, not very difficult, but more seeing the conditions of a woman working at that time and how difficult it was, it's very lighthearted for that. And the characters are delightful, even the kids that are just absolute brats. One of the characters is named Rosalie. She's the oldest girl of one of the families that Agnes is governing, and you can't help but, she is a total flirt. She's very vain, she's very full of herself, but you can't help but like this character, even though she's kind of terrible, because the way that Anne Brontë describes her and the interactions she has is just so entertaining. And you see sort of these little arcs with these characters that sort of demonstrate different lessons, but it never overtakes the story. One of the things that turns people off to this book is it is very Christian in its nature. Obviously, the Brontë sisters were raised by a pastor. Her father was a pastor who worked in the church. And so there's faith in all of their books, very much so. Jane Eyre has a lot of elements of faith, but I think with this one, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Anne Brontë has the most elements of faith, discourses on faith, discussions of it in this book as compared to any of the other Brontë sisters books. And I know that's off-putting for some people, and if you're not a Christian, if you don't believe that, it could be very maybe boring, but I think it's still worth reading, because reading different people's perspectives and beliefs and views is important for thinking about the world around you and challenging your own thoughts and opinions. But those parts just make the book all the more endearing to me. I love it. I think there are some lessons in here that Agnes sees and that Agnes talks about in her long suffering, and the character of Agnes and the things you learn about her, the things she suffers through and lives through and takes with all the fruits of the Spirit and the patience and compassion, and the way she treats other characters in the novel and the way she helps other people. I think there's a lot to learn from that, and a lot of just gentle lessons and good lessons that are good reminders, but also very comforting to read about, I think, because we lose sight of a lot of these things in our culture and in a lot of even just other books written with the best intentions. So I think this book is very good at just having those gentle reminders, and some sections are definitely preachy, but I like those sections. Again, I love them. I think the way that the gospel is presented in Agnes Grey is a simple gospel that I think we miss out on a lot in the modern church or in modern presentations, and a good reminder of what it really means to follow the Lord and to love others around us, and that his yoke is easy, his burden is light, those sorts of things. And I have to say, the romance in the book is very sweet. I laughed because one of the reviews I saw on Goodreads, somebody was complaining because they said all there was at the end was an elbow touch. It's like, well, you have to understand that this time period, it was a little bit different, and they don't write about all the things that we write about now in books where you're like, oh, wow, maybe tone it down a little bit. But I think the romance is very sweet. Edward Weston is the love interest for Agnes Grey, and it's a very, very sweet and very thoughtful and just very, very gentle romance. And again, like I said, this book is very short. My copy is only 150 pages, I think, and the story is very simple and just elegant, and sort of slowly plods along and covers lots of different characters in a very short amount of time. And I think that's part of what makes it so good, is that it's a short and sweet read. It's very endearing, it's very comforting. Like I said, it's warm. There's nothing too crazy that happens, nothing too catastrophic. It's just the life of one girl who is just trying to help her family and help those around her and live out her faith to the best of her ability. And she also falls in love and has a very happy ending. And I think it's very sweet. And I think it's just so underrated and so forgotten, and it's absolutely worth reading. A simple story like this is oftentimes overlooked because it's simple. We like stories with all these thrills, and we like stories that are exciting and have these high stakes or these really painful lows and high highs. But sometimes a story that slows down and is just sort of a commentary on life, just a story of someone's life, just a little bit, is what you really need in a moment. And that's why, to me, this book is always a go-to when I want something chill. I read it after Anna Karenina, so I need a break from these long, really emotional books, and this was exactly what I needed. So to close out, I'm going to read you the first paragraph because when I read the first paragraph the first time, basically my life was changed. It's such a good paragraph. Not really, but it's such a good paragraph. I'm obsessed with it. I, to this day, think it's one of the best openings to any book ever. So I'm going to read that, and then I'll be done. So it says, all true histories contain instruction, though in some the treasure may be hard to find, and when found, so trivial in quantity that the dry, shriveled kernel scarcely compensates for the trouble of cracking the nut. Whether this be the case with my history or not, I am hardly competent to judge. I sometimes think it might prove useful to some and entertaining to others, but the world may judge for itself. Shielded by my own obscurity, and by the lapse of years and a few fictitious names, I do not fear to venture, and will candidly lay before the public what I would not disclose to the most intimate friend. Again, love this book. It's such a good, sweet story, and if that's what you're looking for, it's perfect for a Sunday afternoon or for a cold fall day. We just want to sit down and read a book. So I hope you'll give Agnes Grey a try. It definitely deserves it. It's my favorite of the Brontë sisters' works. I love it even more than Jane Eyre, and I love Jane Eyre, so that's saying something. So I hope you'll check this one out. It definitely deserves it.